Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for joining us for the 4 o'clock news and politics show, and we've got a good one for you. Very hard to top Molly O'Brien at 3 o'clock though, having in penguins from Mystic Aquarium, our friend Jeremy Duffy from Isle Brewers, and a great lineup, so be sure to check that out if you haven't had the chance to already. But I'm very excited to welcome in my first guest in. This is Dr. Will Bundy with the U.S. Naval War College. Served in the Navy for more than 30 years prior to returning to the college as a faculty member. He has led warfighting concept development and advanced research projects that have been deployed by both in the fleet and the Joint Force. Now, we have seen this week the DARPA did go through the final training, trials of Sea Hunter, which is the largest unmanned Navy ship, and we're going to have Dr. Bundy in to talk about it. Thanks for coming in today, sir.
It's good to be here.
I appreciate it because we've got the top experts in the world at the Naval War College.
Thank you very much.
And I said, who can I talk with Sea Hunter about? And people said, you must talk to Dr. Bundy. So talk with us about your knowledge of this and how this came to fruition from concept to where we are today.
We have an organization entitled DARPA. It's an acronym for developmental organization. They are funded to look at technology and capabilities that can be used in the military. And so some years ago they started a process, as a matter of fact online, of a model of a ASW continuous track unmanned vehicle, and they provided that to individuals who could go online and play with this game. And the game was set up so that you would have this unmanned system follow a submarine around. And we had a number of people do that. It was completely available to the public. We got a lot of information back about how it might operate. I guess it was kind of crowdsourcing an idea about this ACTUV. Later on, money was dedicated to build a prototype, and the prototype is about 180 feet long.
Okay.
I was on board Sea Hunter about a year and a half ago in San Diego. The idea is that the ship can carry any number of payloads. Payload is a capability that we can use. For instance, in the open press here recently, we talked about a towed parachute that you can put a sensor in and tow it from the back of a ship. And that was one of the tests that was conducted with the Sea Hunter. In addition to that, the idea is to use unmanned surface vessels, unmanned undersea vessels, much the way oil companies use unmanned, remotely controlled vessels that go under the sea. And the idea is dull, dirty, right, and dangerous work can be done by machines that do not have people on board. And we operate them in a couple of different ways. First of all, many are familiar with the aircraft that we put up. And they are operated remotely, so there is a pilot and others, and I'm sure some of the audience has seen the movies around that about using unmanned aircraft to do surveillance, and in fact, use them in armed conflict. And so those are operated by a person that can communicate with that unmanned system. We call that a person in the loop, or man in the loop in our language. And then there are our systems that we have where there is a person on the loop. So it's somebody who programs this unmanned system and sends it out to do a mission. So with the ACTUV surface vessel, the key that we had to really understand is how do you operate within the international laws of navigation. The coal rigs, we call that. It was the ability not to have our unmanned system collide with another vessel. And there's some basic rules about that, about the meeting situation, crossing situations, and they are pretty much standard. And you can program computers and sensors to operate within that environment. And that is one of the key factors with the ACTUV or Sea Hunter. The audience will recognize that it is a prototype. It's a test vessel. And so DARPA had it for a number of years. They've just finished some tests to make sure we could operate it at sea in an unmanned environment. That was done successfully. And then a number of payloads, for instance, the towed payload that I just talked about. And now that all of that has been done and it's a proven concept, the Sea Hunter has been turned over to our Office of Naval Research. You can read about that in the paper. The Office of Naval Research is now going to do more testing, really start to understand what payloads can be operated from a large unmanned vessel. And I would suspect that we will build larger unmanned vessels. On the commercial side, their job is to get cargo from one point to another point as quickly as possible and efficiently as possible. And so the commercial shipping industry is also looking at unmanned systems. They can have the luxury of having a very small crew aboard a large ship, and the ship will operate autonomously, semi-autonomously, we might call it, where the crew can see what's going on. If they really need to go to the bridge, they can, but otherwise the ship can navigate on its own. So
the ship can kind of sail itself, and you've been on the Sea Hunter.
Yes, I had the opportunity to visit it and walk around and look under, under the hood, so to speak.
Take a peek underneath.
Yeah.
So you talk about the payload capacity. So is there an amount of space that can be utilized for, and again, no one on it, so they'll put a lot of stuff on.
Yeah, well, there are systems that we can put in the hull, in racks and equipment racks. That's available. It has, of course, its own engine and fuel and that sort of thing. And then there is space above deck. And so if you go online and look at the Sea Hunter as it's designed, there is space forward of the bridge or the pilot house, and then there's space aft that you might be able to put a container with equipment and capability in. And then, of course, you can have a control system ashore that talks to the unmanned vehicle and either operated in a semi-autonomous mode where you tell it to do some things and it does it, and then it comes back and checks in with you, or fully autonomous where you might leave it alone for a significant period of time.
And you talk about the potential to see more of these vessels moving forward, having gone through the DARPA process, and now with the Navy. Is this the future of naval operations?
Yes, if you talk to, we have a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Unmanned Systems. I've had a chance to work with the Deputy Secretary. And what his office foresees is an integrated Navy,
okay.
In which you have machines that operate either autonomously or fully autonomously or semi-autonomously, and you have manned or vessels with people that operate. And so, as a matter of fact, one of the interesting things to look at is a British design. It's called Dreadnought 2050. And you can look that up, of course, when you're...
The Dreadnought 2050, so 2050. What are they up to?
Well, that's a very large concept vessel. It operates unmanned air vehicles, unmanned undersea vehicles, and unmanned surface vehicles.
Wow.
And it's a concept. It's all drawings and that sort of thing, but you can imagine what you can do with that for a sea control type operation, and that's the British. They have that idea.
So how much through this process, as we've talked about them going through the trial process, how much do countries sort of keep this new technology close to their vest, so to speak, and then sort of let the rest of the world know that what we're up to?
Well, it's an interesting topic. We talk about technologies and capabilities coming online that one country may have, and they will then start to deploy it.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't take very long for potential adversaries and even partner nations to start to use that same type of technology. Then there's kind of a cycle. So I come along with the aircraft carrier. We build the aircraft carrier capability, and then our partners start to do the same thing. And if we recall back into World War II, the Japanese had a carrier force. As a matter of fact, it was a carrier force that attacked Pearl Harbor. And so this idea of capabilities starting in one country, another country will adopt it, really gets into something we call the revolution in military affairs.
Okay.
And so the revolution is caused by some capability, a longer range rifle, an aircraft carrier. And one of the very interesting approaches around that is the nuclear-powered submarine. And nuclear-powered submarine revolutionized undersea warfare. And so we were able to build Nautilus, and after Nautilus, other nations started to build, their versions of nuclear-powered submarines. So that starts this revolution in military affairs, and so that's kind of the answer to your question.
That is the answer to what happens next. And what happens, Doctor, with these unmanned drones? You talk about them doing sort of the rank and file work of transporting goods and services. Could these be used in warfare? Are these intended to be used with weapons or warfare tactics on board?
Well, we have weapons today that are pretty smart. We talk about homing torpedoes, and so you launch a torpedo and the torpedo can find its target. There are a number of papers out now that talk about the laws of armed conflict and the humanitarian side of warfare. What's humane? What is it that we should do? The idea of a weapon system or a unmanned system engaging in detect to engage another or an adversary has been debated quite a bit. And there are discussions about whether or not we ought to do that. And so there are proponents who argue there ought to always be a person in the loop to make critical decisions. Others believe that there are to be people on the loop, and that you send a system out semi-autonomously or autonomously where you have a level of control, but you're not actually a remote control environment. So that is a discussion that is going on. The idea of cognitive computing, people think about artificial intelligence. I always start that conversation with something called intelligent agent technology, and it's really building technology, digital technology, cognitive technology that allows a machine to understand what it is supposed to do. And I use the term understand, which is kind of human, but you program
AI.
it. That's right, you program it. It is an intelligent agent of a human being, and that machine will do what you tell it to do. Now, the key is assurance, that you put that system in play. You have to test it. You want to make sure that the commanders and operators who own those systems are fully aware what the system would do, and they build what trust and confidence in those systems. And so as we start to bring more autonomy into the private sector, more autonomy into the military, a number of those questions will be resolved. I would tell your viewers, one of the more interesting things to look at is Kevin Kelly's book. It's called The Inevitables. He talks about a period in our future called Technium, in which you and I and others will really depend on our technology. And today, we depend on it quite a bit, don't we?
Absolutely.
Smartphones, keeping track of things. Right now, you can talk to your car, tell it where you want to go by city and by state and city and address, and it will then tell you the right and left turns to make and what the distances are. We also have the next steps for fully autonomous vehicles, in that you have cruise controls that allow you to operate, and the car will slow down when you're starting to get too close to a car ahead of you. They will operate and keep you in the correct lane. And of course, you've seen the cars that park themselves. And
Yes.
so these technologies are, are fast approaching, and we're going to depend on them a lot in our future lives. And so that idea is called Technium. And so for those that do a lot of reading, there's a Dan Brown book out today, and it's called Origin. And I would suggest that your viewers get a copy of that, or you can get it on Audible. Some people take that approach. And I want you to meet one of the characters, and the character's name is Winston, like Winston Churchill.
Indeed.
Okay, and so
I've read Origin.
Oh, you have. All right. So then you know where we're headed with this.
Yes.
Without telling everybody, I want.
It's a great read.
Yeah.
So The Inevitables, read Origin, and then again, I appreciate your coming in and breaking it down for people as to what you see. These headlines, you see largest unmanned ship going now to the Navy after the trial period. And we've got the best minds at the Naval War College right here down in Newport that we're able to get up here in the studio and give us some context. So I appreciate your taking the time to come in. And hopefully we'll have you back soon.
Well,
okay.
Be glad to.
Dr. Bundy, I appreciate your time. I'll let you around the corner, back down to Newport. Have a safe journey back.
Okay.
Okay, I appreciate it. Dr. Will Bundy with the Naval War College. You might have seen the news this week of Sea Hunter, the Department of Defense's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, just completed its trials of Sea Hunter, this largest unmanned vessel. It was great to get Dr. Bundy in here to get his take on it. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with our next guest in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News editor Kate Nagel. Just want to thank Dr. Will Bundy coming up from the U.S. Naval War College to talk about what you may have seen in the news recently, Sea Hunter, the largest unmanned drone ship now being transferred to the Navy. What to expect with unmanned technology moving forward. He is in it, so I appreciate him taking the time to give us some context here at the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I am very excited to welcome my next guest here into the studio. He's got a film screening tomorrow night here in East Greenwich. This is Tim DeChristopher. He is Bitter 70. Thanks for coming in today. I appreciate
thanks for
it.
having me.
Well, I know you've got the film screening tomorrow night, but let's tell folks what this is all about. We've given them a preview. Let's go back to 2008 and even before. You're an environmental activist. The Bureau of Land Management was having a oil and gas auction for land, and you said, I'm going to come in and try to derail the process.
Right, yeah, so this was the very end of the Bush administration, and it was kind of their last big giveaway to the oil and gas industry for land right outside of Arches and Canyonlands National Parks. And at that time, I had been growing more and more concerned around climate change and seeing the need for more confrontational tactics. And so I was looking for an opportunity like this, and it would really just embodied the drill now, think later mentality that's driving us to the climate crisis. And so I showed up with some kind of intent to do what I could to stand in the way of it, and ended up seeing the opportunity there to disrupt the auction by bidding. And it proved really effective, and it also proved to be kind of a unique moment where it turned out that there were a lot of other people also quietly hoping for that kind of opportunity, and quietly hoping for a movement that had that kind of seriousness of putting our actions in line with our sentiment about how climate change is such a serious and urgent crisis.
So 1.8 million Did you have $1.8 million in your back pocket?
No, I did not. You know, when they took me aside to ask me what I was doing, I said, this is an act of civil disobedience. I'm trying to stop this auction in any way I can because it's a fraud against the American people and a threat to my future. So, you know, that began a very long legal process.
Did you have the lawyer before, or did you get one after?
I got one after, yeah, and it took them about 4 months until they even pressed charges because they had to find an obscure law that would actually apply to the situation. But yeah, it began a 2.5-year legal process, which then I was convicted. I served 2 years in prison after that, and have continued my work. And so at the event tomorrow night at the Westminster UU Church, I'll be filling folks in on sort of everything that happened after the film, because the film really wrapped up at the point when I went to prison in 2011.
Okay.
And so a lot has happened in that last 6.5, almost 7 years since I went to prison, and so I'll be filling folks in on that.
And so did you anticipate this in 2008, knowing that you could go down this very twisting and turning legal path? Did you know that prison could be an option?
Yeah. I mean, I figured it would. I thought it was a much more like go directly to jail, do not pass go sort of thing.
Like they just haul you out right there.
Right. Yeah. I didn't realize just how arcane and complicated our legal system was until I actually had to go through it myself. And so I learned a lot from that, but I also saw how impactful it was to other people, how many other people it motivated to get engaged with working for climate justice themselves. And so out of that action, I ended up starting an organization called Peaceful Uprising that encouraged a lot of similar kinds of civil disobedience in Utah. And then when I moved out to the East Coast here in 2013, I started an organization called the Climate Disobedience Center that is a resource and support center for other folks engaging in civil disobedience, and also built small groups of activists and people that want to kind of live in integrity with responding to the climate crisis.
Were you surprised when you did this civil disobedience at the end of the Bush administration, which had its own track record with the environment, then under the Obama administration, which would have seemed to be a little more receptive to maybe environmental activism? Or do you think just the book was the book and they were going to throw it at you no matter who was president?
Yeah, I mean, that was complicated. You know, the judge and the district U.S. attorney there in Utah were both very conservative ideological folks that were pushing this prosecution. But you know, especially the first term of the Obama administration was incredibly disappointing from the perspective of the climate crisis. You know, the Obama administration ignored a lot of huge opportunities there when they had the worst oil disaster in history, the worst coal mining disaster in a generation that killed 29 miners in West Virginia, and the worst nuclear disaster in a generation, all within the span of about a year. No one has ever had such great political will to say, we need to dramatically change the way we produce energy. And they not only missed that opportunity, you know, they opened up huge new areas to mining. Obama bragged in 2012 that he had put enough new pipelines in the U.S. to go around the world. You know, so it wasn't a tremendous surprise. And of course, you know, now things are much worse than they ever were. And not only are we seeing negative climate policies, but we're really seeing a dramatic erosion of the rule of law, and where people are even further removed from the democratic process, which you know means more and more people are now resorting to civil disobedience because they see that it's the only way they can make their voices heard.
So what was the ultimate outcome of this piece of land that you had bid on, this $1.8 million, and was the legal ramification that they expected you to pay the $1.8 million? You're like, I never had it, this is why I did it. What is the status of that land today?
Well, that was one thing. When the new Obama administration did come in, they invalidated that auction. They rescinded those parcels that I bid on and admitted that they weren't following their own laws in the first place. And yet they prosecuted me after
I was going to say, shouldn't that make...
And so that put that land then in the legal limbo that a lot of our public lands in the West are in, where they're not actively being exploited, but they're not really protected either. And so some of those parcels ended up being part of what the Obama administration named as Bears Ears National Monument at the very end of their administration, and what the Trump administration is now trying to overturn and shrink that monument by 90%.
So 2 years in prison?
Mm-hmm.
What was that experience like?
It was frustrating. It was boring. You know, I sometimes say that the federal prison is kind of a cross between living at the DMV and high school. But it was also a real learning opportunity for me, you know, to really be living and spending time and hearing stories from a lot of the most oppressed people in our society, people who are not only obviously currently oppressed, but most of whom got into that situation because they were disenfranchised in one way or another. And so for me, it helped to internalize a lot of the social justice things that I understood in my head. You know, like I had read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander before I went into prison. And so I could have cited those statistics, but to actually be living it with people just made it so much more real for me.
And Bitter 70, the documentary itself, it's the darling. It's winning award after award after award. Talk with us about that process and working with filmmakers, and did you expect this type of reception?
I didn't really know what to expect in terms of reception, but you know, the filmmakers were a couple named George and Beth Gage, retired, who had spent their careers making films and making commercials. And they just kind of followed me around and followed Peaceful Uprising around for 2.5 years, and then they kind of became like my surrogate grandparents. And you know, and then after I got out of prison, I did a lot of work with the film. You know, at this point, it's kind of history in some ways. And I've worked on other films since then. I did a film called How to Let Go of the World and Love All the Things That Climate Can't Change that Josh Fox made, and traveled around with that a couple years ago. So, you know, my work has continued since then, as have a lot of other folks in the climate movement that are continuing on that struggle and continuing to do similar kinds of actions. And
so you were in Utah. Talk to us why the move to the East Coast.
Well, after I got out of prison, I came out here to go to Harvard Divinity School, and so I spent 3 years doing that and got my Master's of Divinity there. And that really grew out of my time as a climate activist, where I was seeing that our challenge as a movement was shifting from being just about reducing emissions to being at least as much about how we can maintain our humanity as we navigate this period of chaotic disruption that to a large degree is now inevitable. And looking around the movement at that time, I saw that we didn't have any of the tools and skills to even begin having that conversation. But I felt like our religious traditions did have a certain set of tools and skills to address that feeling of despair and that feeling of extreme loss, because that's so often what people turn to religion for.
And the screening tomorrow night, was that the decision to hold it at the church, the combination of the factors?
Yeah, you know, and that's at the Unitarian Universalist Church there in East Greenwich, and so they reached out to me to host that, and Unitarian Universalist churches have really been supportive of me throughout my whole process here, from my local church there in Salt Lake City to national churches, and so that's often where this film screens at this point.
So big question for you, would you do it all again?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've learned a lot. I think I would do it better this time, and
get the lawyer before.
Yeah, well, and I am, you know, and I'm also like bringing more people along. So next month, March 27th, I go to trial up in Boston for another civil disobedience action.
What'd you do now?
I did about a year and a half ago when they were putting the West Roxbury natural gas pipeline through that neighborhood of Boston, and there was a lot of sustained resistance against it, and it was when there was news about how Pakistan was digging anticipatory mass graves because the heat wave that was coming, and the year before it had been so severe that they had thousands of bodies with nothing to do with. And even as someone who pays a lot of attention to these issues, that really just broke my heart in a whole new way. And looking at the pictures of that trench that they were digging for a mass grave, it looked just like the trench that they were digging through West Roxbury. And of course, these things are connected, that if we're already at that point of anticipatory mass graves because of climate change, then that means that every new piece of fossil fuel infrastructure is a new mass grave somewhere in the world. And so we did an action to sort of make that explicit and connect those dots. And with a big movement there and a lot of local clergy, we laid our bodies down in the trench to make it clear that this was a mass grave. And so 15 of us are going to trial at the end of March up in Boston to make the case that those kinds of actions are now a necessity to prevent the greater harm from climate change.
And do you have any anticipation what to expect from this legal proceeding?
I don't. I mean, it's a radically different situation than I was in with my case back in Utah. This is a case where every elected official who represents that community tried to stop that pipeline. The city of Boston sued to try to stop that pipeline, and there was nothing that they could do. So, our defense team is actually going to put a city councilor from Boston on the stand who's going to testify that they tried everything they could within the legal system and within the rule of law to try to protect their communities from this pipeline, and there was nothing that they could do, and that's why we ended up doing civil disobedience. And more that's the case, and even this week we got more news about how the Trump administration's infrastructure plan is further reducing the opportunities to legally object to natural gas pipelines and to further fast track those so that communities that are impacted have even less of a voice. So more and more communities are finding that if they want to protect themselves, if they want their voices to be heard, they have to create their own opportunities for doing it.
Well, I appreciate your taking the time to come in here when we had heard from you about this. Again, this screening tomorrow night in East Greenwich will have a link up for that as well, if there's still space, I would hope.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're interested in Bitter 70 and Tim's story, but again, it's just, as you said, historical, just a back look at something you've gone through, but you're clearly going through it now as well, so I appreciate you taking the time to come in today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Tim, thanks so much. I'll let you go around the corner.
All right,
okay.
you.
Tim DeChristopher is Bitter 70. This is the award-winning documentary about his action back in 2008 out in Utah, where he basically single-handedly derailed a Bureau of Land Management oil and gas auction and was subsequently held legally responsible, spent 2 years in federal prison. The cross between the DMV and the high school was an interesting perspective from Tim. I appreciate his taking the time to come in here into the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center to tell his story. We do still have one more guest here to wrap up the week in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. You might read him often on GoLocal. Rob Horowitz, Democratic consultant, I believe is around the corner. Rob, thanks for taking the time to come in this week. Take a little step a little closer here.
This way.
And we'll talk about everything that's been going on this week.
Sure.
And we have to start with Florida. We've seen an outcry of the results of what we saw down there, and of course, people saying, don't need thoughts and prayers, need action, and this is just one of many school shootings, unfortunately, that we continue to see. What's the prospect from your perspective on anything happening?
I think in the short term, there isn't a great prospect. I went and looked back in 2013, Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, conservative Republican, Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania, put the Manchin, and this wasn't very far after Sandy Hook. They put in the Manchin-Toomey amendment or bill, which would have just required a universal background check. Didn't take anyone's gun away, and that didn't get enough votes in the U.S. Senate. It got a majority, but it didn't get to 60. And if anything, the climate's gotten worse for common sense gun legislation. You'd have to see some electoral change, and you'd also have to see the common sense gun control folks get more traction on the ground, I think.
And is there potential for this to happen? We're looking at 18, we're looking at midterms. What do you think the prospect is for this election year?
It's possible because the bigger problem's in the House. And you could see, you can't tell yet, it's too early, and the economy is improving. Election held today, Democrats would probably take the House. Election held in November, who knows?
A lot of water between here and there. I mean, what are the conversations you've had with elected officials and folks in Democratic circles, again, since this latest tragedy?
I think there isn't a lot of optimism short term about the kinds of changes, and you can even sort of see the reaction. For example, Speaker Paul Ryan saying, and sort of a typical reaction, which is, it's inappropriate to talk about politics today, but then there's never a day where it is appropriate to talk about the gun stuff. So it's a stalling mechanism. And when a different kind of tragedy happens, or a different kind of, it's a terrorism activity and people die, it's never then too early to talk about politics.
So tell viewers here, as we're here in the studio, your thoughts on what we've heard about the FBI, and basically FBI admitting that they fell down here. What happens now?
In terms of the FBI falling down on this one? Well, the good thing is what the FBI did is what the Trump administration should learn how to do overall, which is when you make a mistake, you admit it. Right?
They admitted it. They put the statement out that.
They put the statements out, and just as the Air Force did, I believe it was the Air Force when they didn't do, when they didn't transmit the information the last time there was a tragedy. So the more people at least are going to admit it. I think when you admit a mistake, it's still a disturbing mistake. People are much more willing to sort of be forgiving. So I think the FBI handled it perfectly.
Well, that was interesting to see, and again, such a heartbreaking tragedy in Florida and the reaction to it. And Democratic standpoint from Rob Horowitz, I want to ask you about what's taking place on the Hill in terms of immigration this week and what we saw with the Senate.
It's pretty discouraging, but there still might be a chance for a compromise. You saw 3 bills go down. The one that went down the biggest actually was the Trump administration proposal that went down 60-39. One bill got a majority. Still seems to me and it may not happen short term, 90% of the country wants the Dreamers to have a path at least to legalization, if not to citizenship. Most people are for border security. If you would keep it to those 2 things, you could get a compromise.
So it says sort of keep it simple, stupid?
Exactly. Once you get into trying to reduce legal immigration, which is the other piece of the thing the Trump administration is trying to do, and once you get into trying to change the visa lottery, which essentially makes our immigration more diverse, that's a much more complicated, much more difficult task. And I think both of those policies are well advised by that. But however you ever feel about the policy, if you're looking on a deadline, make it simple. Trump administration, I'm not sure they want an agreement here. I mean, they weighed in very heavily against the bipartisan Lindsey Graham proposal with Senator Durbin, and that's sort of Steve Miller's advice, who's a very hardline immigration person. I think that's bad political advice. I think if you could get a deal, it would be better for Trump. At some point, if you're at 40% approval, 42% approval, with a roaring economy, that's you have to decide to expand the people that are supporting you, not just hold on to them, because holding on to them doesn't get you a majority.
So let's stay at the national level before we tack back to local politics. The news today, Mueller and the 13 indictments of Russians. I mean, did we see this coming? There's been such a focus on the White House and members of the administration. All of a sudden, we're pulling Russians in. What's the response been to this today?
I think the amazing thing about the Mueller investigation, with all the leaks going on, and by the way, most of the leaks coming out of the White House. It's
yes.
The leakiest White House I can ever remember. Usually when there's lots of dysfunction, there's leaks. The Clinton White House was maybe half as many leaks. This was pretty dysfunctional.
This is the leakiest administration.
This would be great to be in D.C. getting all those leaks, because that's what's going on.
I'm not writing the fire of the fury though, but anyhow. But is it surprising how no one knew this was coming?
After no one knew when the Flynn indictment was coming, no one was cooperating. The Mueller plays it close to the vest, so yes. I don't think that's a surprise. I think we really don't know exactly what he's doing, and that's good. He's keeping it all secret. But it's a very, very important indictment, and it puts to rest, just for the national interest, whatever is going to happen in terms of collusion and the rest of it, it should put to rest. It may not on Fox News from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. when they're out there where the buses don't run, but it mainly puts to rest any doubt about the fact that the Russians were very involved. It is a very specific indictment. 13 Russians, 3 companies. We're talking about making up American identities. We're talking about millions of dollars spent on social media and ads. It's a very expansive indictment, and the unwitting cooperation of at least 3 Trump associates. No one's saying they did it intentionally, at least yet. And so in terms of just, because the main thing for the country isn't necessarily what happens in terms of the whole moral inquiry going backwards, is what's going to happen in the 2018 elections. You had the 4 national security folks, FBI director, director of national intelligence, CIA director, etc., on the Hill the other day, all Trump appointees, by the way, all saying the Russians are still meddling and that they meddled in 2016. The only person who still hasn't gotten the memo, and he kind of half got it today, is the president. So that's what we got to be focused on, is because there were probes this time into our election systems in the states. No change of votes, but probes. But we're still not doing nearly enough to harden election security. Imagine if the Russians had changed some votes. Actually, so if this can just take that argument off the table and say, now we know the Russians are attempting to influence our elections. The evidence is overwhelming. then we could get a bipartisan solution, at least going forward, about how we're going to protect the integrity of our elections and our democracy.
Do you think we'll see, we just, again, heard of the indictments, here we are, it's February, election season will sort of really heat up in earnest come the summertime. We don't know how quickly or not quickly. Do you think this will sway the election or what we find out from these indictments?
Will it sway the 2018 election, the indictments themselves?
No, what we find from what the ultimate results ends up being.
I think it depends on this. I think it's going to help the Democrats some. And a lot of this is the president's reaction to it. If from day one he has said yes, as opposed to saying it's a hoax, who knows, it's a 400-person man on a bed, we don't know, because you just can't admit anything that interferes. Seriously made up the fact that there's 4 million people that evidently voted illegally for Hillary Clinton. And all the illegal people that voted, every one of them voted for Hillary Clinton. Like, not one of them would have voted for Donald Trump. I mean, it's insanity. So if he had said from day one, I didn't want the help, I won the election legitimately, but this is a genuine national security crisis, this wouldn't be hurting him as much. But it's sort of because he's in the bunker on it. And even the statement they put out today was ridiculous. Half of it was in all caps. I mean, if that's going to be your attitude, yeah, it's going to hurt.
I didn't see the all cap statement.
It's you should check it out. It's a Sarah Sanders special, but you almost was the press secretary. You almost feel bad for her because he's sitting there dictating it to her.
And is she putting the caps in because he's yelling? Is that, or did she just keep the caps lock on?
Well, just keeps it on. It's like keeping the when you ever get an email in 24-point red type. I mean, it's sort of the same thing.
The caps locks are on. Well, I want to tack from national issues to one that we've seen here locally this kind of past week unveiled. This arrangement between the Providence Democrats and Gina Raimondo's campaign. We saw it unravel a little bit when we didn't have sort of the full details, especially at the city council level, the city Democrats level. We've since seen Patrick Ward step down for other reasons. But now we see the Republicans really making an issue of this. Can governors have special relationships with the Providence City Democrats? I mean, what's your thoughts on this?
It's completely legal. And by the way, who are we going to believe on campaign finance law? Brandon Bell, the Republican chair, who's doing his job, making an issue, or the executive director of Common Cause, John Marion, who's an expert on the issue and doesn't have an extra right. Marion said it was legal. It is legal. Now, should we change our campaign finance system and reform it completely? Yes. Are we going to do that before November 2018? About less chance of that than the gun control thing happening. So everything is legal. He can flap his gums all he wants. He will score a few points. At the end of the day, she's doing nothing wrong, and there are ways to do these agreements which candidly enable you to raise more money because the limit in Rhode Island is only $1,000, and you can raise it for party building activities and get out the vote, and it is all well within. We're not even at the edge here. This is well within the law.
It's within the law, and you see the allegations being put forth by the Republicans that they make it look like there's some impropriety, and then she's got control over who's staffing and who's at the city Democrats level. But should that be a concern?
Marion looked at that too, said nothing unethical. First of all, the guy's not there anymore. You still got the agreement, right? So what's the issue? I mean, he resigned, not because of this.
Not because of this.
Had nothing to do with it.
But because this was all orchestrated prior to that, prior to something coming out of left field,
I could see where you could try to make some hay of it, but it doesn't work. He's a state employee, so it's a typical kind of agreement, which is very standard in these kinds of elections. So I think there's no there. Give Bell credit for jumping up and down, making some noise and getting some headlines. He's doing his job as a party chair, but you have to remember he's a party chair with an axe to grind. The experts said there's no there.
There's no there. Well, speaking of what's there, what can we expect from Rob Horowitz maybe for a next column? I know it's tough because you're in the news cycle, so it's hard to predict. But what do you think we'll be looking for?
I try to wait, not just because I love to procrastinate everything, but I do try
to
wait
want to be in the news cycle,
but you want to be in the news cycle. But as of today, I think I'll write on the Russia indictments because I think, again, it's not just a partisan issue. It really is an issue about how can we come together and protect our democracy. And what happened in 2016 was an attack on our country. Trump appointments, these are not Democrats, Trump appointed people saying, national security experts, to a person saying it's still happening, they're still doing it, we, you know, at the end of the day, all we have is trust in a democracy, and there's little supply of it anyway. We don't want to erode the one thing that we're mostly, besides Donald Trump, when it serves his interests, reasonably certain about, which is the elections are basically, in general, free and fair. We have to maintain that.
Well,
so that's what I'll probably write about, unless something else.
Something else comes up. Well, I appreciate your contributions, Rob. We appreciate when we are able to get you here into the studio to talk about all things politics, national and local. Hopefully we'll have you back in the very near future.
Thank you, Kate.
Rob Horowitz, I thank you for taking your time to come on in. I'll let you go around the corner.
Thank you.
Rob Horowitz, Democratic consultant, frequent, regular contributor to GoLocal Prov. Appreciate his taking the time to come back. It's been a little while, but you can read him weekly on GoLocal Prov, talking about, of course, what's going on down in D.C. with the indictments of the Russians by the Mueller investigation and more. We had a pack show, gosh, starting off at 3 o'clock with penguins. Mystic Aquarium was in the studio with Molly. I had a pack show at 4 o'clock. Had Dr. Will Bundy from the Naval War College, Tim DeChristopher, environmental activist, his documentary Bitter 70, getting rave reviews, and he'll be in East Greenwich tomorrow night, and of course Rob Horowitz. So we appreciate your tuning in. We appreciate your watching. We look forward to seeing you next week here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. Wishing everyone a great weekend. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel.